The announcements, one that Gunnar has asked me to make, and that is with regard to this book, which, did you say, Gunnar, it is for sale in here?
It can be ordered.
Oh, it can be ordered, yes. This is a collection of some 17 papers, some of them printed in very small type, so that you may need a magnifying glass to read them unless your eyesight is very, very good. So some of them are a little difficult, even I find, to read for very long at a stretch. But they are reprinted from the symposium which was held in San Diego, California. It was not organized by any of the formal Theosophical Societies, but members of all the various Theosophical groups were invited to contribute to this symposium, which was on the Secret Doctrine. And there are a great number of papers representative of many views and interpretations, and by individuals representing many of the various theosophical organizations. I will be frank to say that in my judgment, the publication is a mixed bag. Some of the articles are quite perceptive and very useful and insightful, and I found others less so. I'll be kind in saying that. I think that the whole thing could have been greatly benefited by some editorial hand that really could have put it into often very much better presentations. But the papers stand unedited, and as I say, there are some very useful and perhaps insightful material. There's some very useful and insightful material in it, but it is not all of the same quality, and I think many students would agree with me. But on the other hand, there can be some benefit derived from it. I'll be frank to admit I do not recommend it in my series on the Secret Doctrine at Crotona, because I do find it a rather mixed sort of thing. So would you like to pass that back to Gunnar? And I bring it to your attention. Obviously, any student, any long-time student, is going to want to have it simply as a record and, to have it available in one's whole library of materials on the Secret Doctrine. But do not go to it if you feel that you just want to get into a deeper study. Well, finally, today I want to come to the stanzas themselves. The last 2 days having been more or less introductory in nature. Now, it's quite evident that stanzas 1 and 2, of course, relate to stages which are very difficult to describe except in negative terms. And I'm going to spend, therefore, much less time on them. They precede, quite necessarily, the outbreathing or emergence of a manifested universe. The use of negatives, which is, of course, very much in the Eastern tradition, not so much in the Western tradition, but very much found in the Eastern tradition, is helpful in telling us precisely what is going to eventually occur and what will be necessary. From that point of view, of course, we could spend our entire time in these 2 weeks studying just these 2 stanzas. But my intent was to try to give an overview, and you have already had a kind of overview of the 7 stanzas yourself. So while these stanzas these first two, contain concepts which are absolutely fundamental, naturally, to the Theosophical metaphysic. I propose now only to enumerate the factors, perhaps that's not the correct word, but I don't know of any other. It will have to suffice, therefore, for the present, that are essential for the full manifestation, full flowering of a manifested system. Just to list them. First and foremost, and I'm going to list them as 5, and I think we can, perhaps it will help if I put them on the board. Again, following what Ianthe has said, it may be helpful, particularly to those of you who struggle with some of the English, and all of you who may have to struggle at times with American English, if I put them. First and foremost, quite obviously, is space. Now, as we well know, the concept of space, as given in the Theosophical worldview, is very different from the normal concept of space as three-dimensional. It has a unique meaning in the occult tradition. The Greek term I've already mentioned is chaos, from a verbal root ka in Greek, and which has the twofold meaning in Greek of holding and releasing, and actually gave rise to the word to yawn, an abyss. It's rather interesting, so that the process of yawning is an out-breathing process. And that, I think, is extremely interesting in light of the film that is produced by breathing outwards. And one gets this in a commentary in HPB's quote from the Occult Catechism, or the commentary as she frequently refers to it, later on in the Secret Doctrine, as a film to the gaze of an entranced seer. Very wonderful phrase that she uses later.
Chasm comes from the same
chasm root. Comes from the same root.
What's that?
C-H-A-S-M.
Yawning hole.
A yawning hole is a chasm, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So the root ka, as I say, has in Greek the twofold meaning of holding and releasing. Later, on page 55 of volume 1, HPB refers to space as the one eternal element or element-containing vehicle, dimensionless in every sense. And here we have that word vehicle, to which Adam referred so meaningfully yesterday. Not something in which we drive about, I think there's a stanza in an old hymn in many Christian churches that talks about the saints ascending the mountain, and the saints have reached the mountain top, and we follow after in their train. And of course, many people think that this is chugging up the mountainside after the saints who have laboriously walked up there while we can go in a train. You see? So this sort of vehicle can conjure up all sorts of imaginary views before us. But we have to be very careful about this particular concept of space. We can next recognize that, for lack of any other word, duration, which is the root of time. In other words, there is closely associated with space, and this, of course, is now in science known as the space-time continuum, a continuum within which or from which the manifested system arises. We've already commented a bit that this could absorb us for some time, this concept. And I had referred you to the two faces of time as perhaps a useful work in coming at some of the concepts that have influenced cultures, influenced thought. We are very much a time-bound society. Our culture is very much time-bound. We are so accustomed to having clocks in our rooms, and it's very difficult for us to somehow adjust ourselves. If we had to live, I've often thought, what would it be like to live for and one entire day with no reference to any mechanical instrument that tells time? What would life be like? You know, one gets up when, you see, as primitive peoples did not have clocks, quite obviously. And their lives were governed by the movement of the sun, the movement of the stars, well, the movement of the earth, but for them, the seeing of the sun rise, the seasons, and so on, so that one lived in a natural way. Why is it that in some cultures, my own country included, when the clock approaches 12 noon, regardless of where the sun is in the sky, one begins to feel pangs of hunger. And one hopes that in the not-too-distant future, lunch will appear, or at least a midday meal. What is it like, you see, to live in a culture in which clocks are non-existent? We are very much time-bound. But even in a culture in which clocks are not present, there is another time binding. It's the time binding of the seasons, or the time binding of the progress of the day, of light to dark and dark to light, and so on. So that, and we may be very much also time-bound by memory, by anticipation. All of these are, in effect, time-binding. They also can naturally be time-releasing. But that is all possible because of the third factor, which is, of course, consciousness. And I'm giving these in the order in which they appear in stanza 1. Consciousness which is coextensive with space, but which manifests through or by means of individualized points, called in the Secret Doctrine the hosts or hierarchies of intelligences. And I would only reiterate what Adam has so strongly emphasized, and which I feel is so important that we continue to emphasize, that we must not see these individualized points as anthropomorphic entities, as somehow big human beings, but only slightly larger than we are, even taller than Adam, and all of them with wings somehow affixed or with halos somehow askew, that we must be very careful, again, because there has been this tendency within the society, unfortunately, in carrying over perhaps fanciful images from our childhood for many of us in the Christian church, in the Christian tradition. And it's very hard. When I was a child in, I think, first or second grade, I remember because I was a Roman Catholic at that period, and I was in a convent school, remember in my reader, I think about second grade, there was the picture of the guardian angel, a very beautiful figure with wings and so on, conducting this small child over a bridge. And somehow this was the protection which somehow surrounded me. And it's very difficult, not to think in that terms, that somehow, come on now, guardian angel, see me through this sort of thing and take me by the hand and so on. So this is very easy. I think it's difficult for us to get out of it. But if we can see these as points, individualized points of energy, contemporary science is helping us very much in this. Now, of course, consciousness is closely related to motion.
Sorry. I thought that the third was mind for me. Is it possible to think the third is mind?
Yes, although I'd rather not use mind at this point. I think then we lapse again I want a much broader term. My feeling is not to use the word mind at this stage.
Mind in matter.
No, not yet.
Spiritual matter.
No, not yet. No, not yet. That would be my view. How do others feel?
This consciousness is really the root of consciousness.
Yes, this is the root of consciousness.
It's not any consciousness we know about.
No, it does become, it manifests, that's why I say it manifests through or by means of individualized points.
But not our mind.
No, not at all. Not at all. At least as I view it. We're not talking about that yet. And so keep the word mind for much lower down, if we can put it that way. You would agree, Adam, too? It seems to me this is as a fallacy we can fall into all too easily. Well, with the arising of consciousness, there comes into existence, and the progress in the first stanza is a very interesting one. The shlokas are there in a very interesting way. And that's why one of these exercises, incidentally, was to take one of the stanzas and cut up the shlokas, not out of your book, but to see if you can put them in the proper order again. Because the order is very important, it seems to me. The order is there for a reason. And so with that arising of consciousness, there comes into existence what HPB calls the ways of bliss and the causes of misery. I could get down, but I don't want to. In a sense, this then is the arising of appearance, the possibility of appearance. And we can subsume this under a term that she uses later for that, of Maya. Because both of these are ways, and we'll see how the Tibetan text approaches this. Indeed, I've already read you a part where the entering is either through samsara or nirvana in the Tibetan text, which is a very interesting one. Now, these are appearances. And so the arising of consciousness, with that comes the possibility of the arising of consciousness. And for the operation now of these, and this I think is all I can call it are agencies for the operation of all of this. Agencies called in the second stanza builders, luminous sons of Manvantaric dawn. So I'm just subsuming them as agencies. I don't know, that may not be the best word. You may come up with another word, which is fine. But these are builders whom she refers to as luminous sons of Manvantaric dawn. Now, each one of these, of course, deserves very long and thoughtful study by the student who would understand the basis of the esoteric tradition, and a careful review of the first two stanzas will indicate their importance, their primary importance. Next, I suggest that we can identify three fundamental principles necessary to understand the essential nature of the cosmogonic process. So I'm giving you three, not the fundamental propositions of HPB, but the three fundamental principles as delineated by Joy Mills. The condition or state which is described in stanzas 1 and 2 is not that of inertness or deadness. Whatever else may be said or may not be said about such a condition, the one essential principle that is present for these to operate, the first essential principle is pulsation. It's the term that HPB uses, so I am using it. Pulsation. Rhythmicity, if you like. Perhaps another way of saying it is rhythmicity. This is, therefore, indicates that it is not in any way inert, not just something lying somewhere. Now that presence then of pulsation, even in a slumbering state, which is indicated by the first stanza, makes possible a buildup of tension, which results, if you like, in a big bang. But whether we call it that or not, the pulsation is of a vibratory capacity which produces sound. This is something that is useful to look at. From pulsation in the unmanifest, or the non-manifest, there emerges, by virtue of increased vibration, all the sounds which congeal as the thingness of manifestation. Now that's quite a term, quite a sentence, and I'd like to illustrate it in just a moment by turning to science. I'll come back to that. But let me just say it once again, that from this pulsation, building into a kind of crescendo, if you like, building a tension, there emerges, by virtue of the increased rate of the vibration, all the sounds which congeal into the thingness of the universe. Another way of saying it is that the fundamental characteristic, if you like, of the fabric of the universe, which in this sense then is called akasha, its fundamental characteristic is sound, vibration, sound. And everything in the manifested universe is only sound. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me just get the third, and then let me come back to that. As a consequence of what I have just said, the primary law governing all processes in the arising, continuing, and ultimate dissolution of a manifested system is, as HPB herself states on page 274 of Volume 1, the universe is worked and guided from within outward. So the process is simply within outward. Now, if we follow these three fundamental concepts in dealing with these five factors, I don't know what else to call them, I think we're on safe ground. Now, let me come back to the second, sound. Turning briefly to science, we can recognize that in the investigations of the subatomic particles, particularly the electrons, it's been proposed, it was first proposed by de Broglie, that the electron had a wave-like behavior, and subsequent experiments, of course, have borne this out. I can't go into all of the work that has been done about this, but just to quote a few passages. For example, Fritjof Capra has reminded us that modern physics has shown us that movement and rhythm are essential properties of matter. That all matter, whether here on Earth or in outer space or wherever, is involved in a continual cosmic dance. He quotes, for example, a statement in Alexandra David Neal's report, a statement made by a Tibetan Lama. All things are aggregations of atoms that dance and by their movements produce sounds. When the rhythm of the dance changes, the sound it produces also changes. Each atom perpetually sings its song, and the sound at every moment creates dense and subtle forms. Now, this is well recognized, certainly in the Tibetan tradition, and in the text translated by Günther, this is what is called the authentic utterance. Authentic utterance. Now, this similarity of view to contemporary physics has become very striking and is well illustrated in quite an amazing work. I don't know that it's still in print, but a work by a biologist who is now dead, but worked some years ago, worked very closely with Fritz Kuntz, in fact. Dr. Donald Hatch Andrews at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and he brought it together in a book called The Symphony of Life, in which, because of this singing of the atoms, he did a number of tests, rather the particles composing the atoms. Dr. Andrews explored this. We have a film, incidentally, in the American section dealing with this, this harmonious universe, which it deals with it, which Dr. Andrews made with the help of Fritz Kuntz. And he gives a beautiful illustration, Dr. Andrews, for what he calls the symphony of anatomy. Let me read it to you. In my finger bone, there are some quintillions of atoms. How much is a quintillion? 5, number of zeros beyond. Each with its rippling cloud of electrons and the waves from which each electron interpenetrating with all those of all the rest. You can get an audible idea of this same complexity as you become aware of the almost infinite intricacy of the tones that you hear coming from this single finger bone. If you could listen, if you could really hear it, the tones would be fantastic. Listen first to the shrillest soprano tones. These tones come from the nucleus of each atom. Below these, there are somewhat lower tones coming from the motions of the individual electron clouds. Still further down the scale, there are tones coming from the synchronous vibration of the nucleus and the cloud that come from atoms moving toward and away from each other. There are still lower tones that come from mass movements of atoms, whole groups of atoms swaying together like the leaves of a tree moving together in a breeze. And of course, you hear the waves in the bone intermingled with the waves from the other bones and the waves from all other parts of the body, the muscles, the nerves, the arteries, the veins, the blood, the skin, the entire flesh vibrating together. And these tones reflect not only the vibrations due to the energy of the atomic nuclei, the energy of the atom's electron, the energy of the total atomic motion. They also reflect the energy of the impulses in the nerves, the circulation of the blood, the chemical dynamics of cell metabolism and replication, the total dynamics of the life process. This is the symphony of life. Thus, this unimaginably complex tapestry of music that is sounding within us every moment of our lives. And this symphony not only is singing within us, it is actually radiating from us in terms of all the mysterious waves that these actions set in motion in the space surrounding our bodies. We call this the auras, but it's actually constant musical motion, vibratory motion. How far this broadcasting of our individual symphony penetrates out into the universe in a significant way, we do not know. Well, Dr. Andrews also quoted from the modern composer Paul Hindemith, who used, as you may know, a 12-tone scale and introduced into contemporary music quite a different tonal basis. This is Hindemith, talking with physicists, biologists, and other scientists who are unaware of the crisis in musical thought, one is always profoundly surprised to how great an extent they operate with concepts analogous to those in musical creation. We have already seen how time and space have their musical equivalents, and there apparently exist similar equivalents to basic laws in the physical sciences. This could lead us to the belief, said Hindemith, that there is some foundation in the ancient idea of a universe regulated by musical laws. Or, to be more modest, a universe whose laws of construction and operation are complemented by a spiritual reflection in musical organisms. The time may perhaps return when musical rules will be, as they were in olden times, an essential part of the code of the physical sciences. Incredible.
Yes.
Paul Hindemith was quite a thinker. If you've ever read his autobiography, it's fascinating.
Connects very well with the morning meditation we had.
Ah, did you?
This morning.
Really?
We were meditating on
Uh-huh.
Symphony
Many
of
of the
Life.
modern
The symphonies.
composers are
Oh, yes.
particularly,
Very,
contemplative.
yes, very much so. So, now Dr. Andrews puts this, of course, in scientific terminology. He says there is every reason to believe that every bit of matter, as matter, in this vast space is linked to every other bit, of course, by gravity. There is every reason to believe that the music of every portion of this space penetrates every other portion of it. So I ask you to consider the view of the universe in the perspective of a space of musical form with well over vintillion dimensions. Now, if you want to know what vintillion is, it is 1 followed by 63 zeros. So the view of the universe in the perspective of a space of musical form. Then nearness or farness is not a question of space separation, but a question of tuning. In other words, as it has been said, the universe is constructed not of matter, but of music. Well, there's very much more that one can take up with this and that we could go into. HPB deals with it I would refer you to Volume 5 in the Adyar edition. This is also, I have only the page number in Volume 5, not in the esoteric writings, which Jeffrey has used, but in Volume 5, pages 484 to 85, HPB has a marvelous statement in which she points out that every impulse or vibration of a physical object producing a certain vibration of the air, that is, causing the collision of physical particles, the sound of which is capable of affecting the ear, produces at the same time a corresponding flash of light, and so on. In the realm of hidden forces, an audible sound is but a subjective color, and a perceptible color but an inaudible sound, and so on. I won't read the entire quote, but I refer you to that, as well as other pages, page 419, where she speaks of the infinite potency in the mouth of the adept of the fundamental sound, Om. Pages 431 to 32, this is all in Volume 5, in which she says, esoteric science teaches that every sound in the visible world awakens its corresponding sound in the invisible realms. Page 443, in which she speaks of the great tone which we hear distinctly in the voice of nature and the roaring of ocean, and so on. She has a great deal on this subject, and of course she does refer in Volume 2, in Volume 1, to the four kinds of sound spoken of in the Hindu tradition, Vach, the goddess Vach. We don't have time to elaborate on all of that, but
What page?
that is, well, I think I didn't get the new reference. Yes, it's along about, well, in Volume 2 of the Adyar edition, page 150, and I failed to translate that into my other one. It's in connection, I think, with stanza 4, however, and she spends a great deal of time on that, and I should have gotten this other reference for you. Yes, it's page 94 and 95. She speaks of this in connection. Yes, Volume 1. I'm sorry, Volume 1. Yes. That whole study is extremely interesting. If you look up in the index of all if you look up in the index under Vach, V-A-C-H, the goddess Vach, in which, of course, there is the delineation of the whole system of manifestation through the four forms, the whole cosmos being the objective form, which is called Vicari Vach. It's an extremely interesting, and of course Subaru deals with this also in the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. You will find Subaru deals with it. And so I merely bring that in here because I think it has this relationship to what we're discussing as a fundamental principle.
Did you notice this? The army of the voice is the prototype of the hosts of the Logos.
Yes. Isn't that marvelous? Yes, the prototype, yes. And the word of the Sefer Yetzirah. Very interesting. Of course, she goes into the origin of speech and so on, all of that, and the allegory that is presented. The specific reference to Vach I still must find for you. I will look it up.
The idea of inaudible sound is fun, isn't it?
It is inaudible sound. So all the time, well, of course, this is going on all the time. But then this is why we can say that this vibration, sound, this pulsation increasing to such a point that it emerges as sound, which congeals then as thingness. So what is your sound? What is the sound of you? You see. What sounds are we making as we move, and what sounds are impinging upon us? Yante?
I'm just curious about the origins of the word rhythmicity. Is it a theosophical invention?
Yes.
It's an invention.
It's an invention, all right, but what's wrong with inventing words?
Why won't rhythm do?
Huh?
Why won't rhythm do?
Well, perhaps rhythm will do, but I wanted to indicate the quality of rhythm, which is rhythmicity. There's a difference somehow to me. So, I mean, this is how English develops.
Pulsation, isn't it?
Yes, pulsation. Well, I don't know. Why not invent words? I like words. Is there anything wrong with, doesn't there give you a different...
It gives a different sound.
It gives a different sound, doesn't it? Rhythmicity than just rhythm. Doesn't it give you a different... yes, I don't know. It just does. You can stop at rhythm if you like, but I like rhythmicity.
It's like elastic, isn't it?
Yes. That's right.
Something that has a quality of being elastic.
Which is elasticity.
Elasticity.
Yes.
Elasticity.
Yes. Yes.
And therefore, rhythmicity
Yes.
is the quality
The quality of having this, you see, and it's a quality which is present there. Yes. Well, I hope my words don't bother you too much. Wait till we come to some of Günther's words. Well, our specific studies of the cosmogonic process, then, can properly begin with stanza 3. When the buildup of tension, and here I'll give you another word, this buildup of tension can become then what we can call intention, which then has to become extension. But it's the buildup which is an inner buildup, intention. Now, there may be also intentionality connected with this. I'm not getting into that at this point. But an intention which has become such by this time, by stanza 3, that an outward movement must take place. It's not, as we must realize, an extension into empty space. Now, this is where, again, we have to be very, very careful. There is no empty space, but simply, as HPB points out, page 63, a change of condition, so that it is space itself that is pulsating, has this quality of rhythmicity, and therefore the buildup of this to a change of condition. To quote HPB more fully, pages 62 and 63, the expansion from within without of the mother, called elsewhere the waters of space, universal matrix, etc., does not allude to an expansion from a small center or focus, but without reference to size or limitation or area, means the development of limitless subjectivity into as limitless objectivity. Not an easy concept, I quite grant you. The ever to us invisible and immaterial substance present in eternity through its periodical shadow from its own plane into the lap of Maya. So however, we have to be cautious, as I say, in our interpretation of this. The lap of Maya is not, and it cannot be, anything other than an aspect of space itself. For the Theosophical metaphysic excludes any concept of a dual reality. We have to be very clear on this. So let us probe this a bit further in the time that remains to us by looking first at shlokas 1 and 2 of stanza 3. And I'm going to read them. They are there, pages 62 and 63, if you want to follow. The last vibration, this is pulsation, of the seventh eternity thrills through infinitude. The mother swells, expanding from within without, like the bud of the lotus. The vibration sweeps along, touching with its swift wing the whole universe and the germ that dwelleth in darkness, the darkness that breathes over the slumbering waters of life. Marvelous language. Now here is indeed the stage of awakening for which the previous two stanzas have been preparatory. An inner pressure within a condition described as darkness must now express itself, and the only metaphor appropriate for that expression is light. This is a metaphor. It's not, let us not think of it as two realities, one darkness, one light, but rather the only metaphor that can be used is light. Indeed, that is, as we've already said, the metaphor used in all creation myths. It seems to be scientifically valid as well. The presence of light indicates a separation, a polarization, the non-dual now manifesting as a primal duality. Compare these two shlokas now with the Tibetan text, which Ginther translates. And if you have Ginther's book or plan to get it, this is on pages 100 and 101. From this ground, the ground totality presencing occurred as follows. This ground, this darkness, if you like, you see. The ground totality presencing occurred as follows. Its spontaneous presence, radiating from deep within as an interiority, radiating from deep within as an interiority, was outwardly propelled by motility, or mobility, I suppose, but he uses motility, so that its intrinsic, outward tending glowing manifested. When the shell of this spontaneous presence exploded, 6 modes of presencing and 2 passageways manifested. So that when the shell of this, in other words, this buildup, and a shell is in inverted commas, so it's merely a figure of speech. When this spontaneous presence exploded, 6 modes of presencing and 2 passageways manifested. The singular, internally radiating, excitatory intelligence. Now notice this. First of all, it is singular, a singularity in astronomical terms, in terms of astronomy, which we'll look at in a moment. The singular, internally radiating, excitatory intelligence. That is, what happens with excitement? It's a more and more of a vibratory rate is increased, isn't it, you see? Isn't this what excitement is? Intelligence, or consciousness, was propelled by motility, the outward tending glowing of excitatory intelligence, so that its inward glowing, its inner glow was outwardly thrust. And that gives this appearance. Now, I don't think you can see these diagrams which he uses, and I am hopeless at drawing some of these, but just hoping that you may be able to see slightly. This singularity, he now has, perhaps I can at least try to illustrate this one. We can get some of this off.
Do need something else to clean that board.
Just clean that part of it, I think that will be enough. From this singularity, then come out, and he has it in this sort of form, from that singularity, that vibratory. Then he shows the close-up view of the oscillation line, as he calls it, in which around each of these there is now appearing a wave-like structure, you see. Around each of these, by the vibration, creates then a wave-like structure, so that you have that around each one in the movement out. He next shows that this rippling effect produces a web, because this is now all united, you see. And it's therefore what he calls the meaning-saturated field of pristine cognitiveness, if you like. Now, I think you may be able to see this then, which he then illustrates as the wider web, which is a marvelous way of illustrating it. And I'll leave these up here. If you, those in the back can't see it, you may be able to come up and see. I think it's a wonderful illustration that he has attempted here of precisely what is happening in this envelope-like, he calls it, meaning-saturated field of pristine cognitiveness ranging over two outward pulsing radiating field lines. So these field lines, if you like, let's see, maybe we can make those, these field lines in here, you see, which are there, create this. And that, of course, is the matrices, if you like, which in crystallography, of course, become the 14 known matrices by which crystals form. But even in all kingdoms of nature, create then, these are the matrices, the axial lines around which all is concreted into the various forms, at the various levels then. And these are the 6 modes of presencing, which are the energy fields which for too long, I think, in the Theosophical world, we have called planes, which are not planes at all, but energy fields around the vibratory radiating lines from the singularity. And it seems to me this gives us another picture. These, now, the 6 modes of presencing then, and the 2 passageways, we can make note briefly by saying that the entire quotation from which I'm reading concludes, the 6 presencing modes are the exploding ground, which means they are, as they move outwards, the energy fields which explode one from the other, as it were. Do you see? The 2 passageways, he says, are invitation to enter. This is the translation of the text. The 2 passageways are invitation to enter. The entering is either samsara or nirvana. These are the ways in and through which the ground totality presencing occurs. The ways of bliss, nirvana, the causes of misery, samsara. So there it is in the Tibetan text, you see. There it is also in contemporary science. So as I say, these the 6 modes of presencing are the fields in which sentient existence will organize itself. And we will see the recurrence of this number later. What occurs in the text that Ginther quotes from, is what he calls an auto-presencing, a self-presencing. And I think that might well be another translation of the word svabhavat, an auto-presencing, a self-presencing, because it is a self-becoming, a self-being, bhava. You see? So it's it's an automatic, it's an a presencing of oneself. And we must take care, therefore, not to assume that something is acting upon something else. And this again is very difficult to have a clear idea, because there's not something out here acting on something here, you see. It's not something it's an auto-presencing. As HPB points out in answering questions on these shlokas, these 2 shlokas in Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, the language used is purely figurative. And she says further, in using figurative language, analogies and comparisons are very frequent. I'd like to quote her just a little further from Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. She says, the universe does not mean the cosmos or world of forms, but the formless space, the future vehicle of the universe which will be manifested. This space is synonymous with the waters of space, with, to us, eternal darkness, in fact, with Parabrahm. In short, the whole shloka, she says, refers to the period before there was any manifestation whatever. But now the possibility of manifestation is present in that pulsation. So we can speak of this first stage in the cosmogonic process then as a radiation, a lighting up of the field, but it is a self-lighting process. A self-lighting process. And this must precede what has been termed the emanational stages. And indeed, HPB takes great care in Transactions to explain the difference between these 2 terms, radiation and emanation. And this is, I think, is essentially important at this point. What we're dealing with here is radiation, you see. And that's what is there in the 3rd stanza. She says, to quote her further, these 2 terms, she says, express to my mind 2 entirely different ideas, and are the best apologies for the original terms that could be found. But if the ordinary meanings are attached to them, the idea will be missed. So she goes on, radiation is the unconscious and spontaneous shooting forth, the action of a something from which this act takes place. And this, therefore, is this spontaneous presencing, as the Tibetan text puts it. Emanation, on the other hand, she says, is something from which another thing issues in a constant efflux and emanates consciously. An orthodox occultist goes so far as to say that the smell of a flower emanates from it consciously, absurd as it may seem to the profane. Radiation can come from the absolute. Emanation cannot. It's something to give us thought, you see. And then she continues, one difference, I'm reading it rather at length because I think her definition, her clarification is so very important for us. One difference exists in the idea that radiation is sure, sooner or later, to be withdrawn again, while emanation runs into other emanations and is thoroughly separated and differentiated. Radiation can be withdrawn. Emanation must run its course. Of course,
It turn back then, mustn't it?
yes, I would think it would have to turn back. Yes. At the end, and she says, of course, at the end of the cycle of time, emanation will also be withdrawn into the one absolute. But meanwhile, during the entire cycle of changes, emanation will persist. One thing emanates from the other, and in fact, from one point of view, emanation is equivalent to evolution, while radiation represents, to my mind, she says, in the pre-cosmic period, of course, an instantaneous action like that of a piece of paper set on fire under a burning glass, of which act the sun knows nothing. Both terms, of course, are used for want of better. It's a rather lengthy quotation, but it's a marvelous answer which she gives. And I think her answers in what's been published for us as the Transactions of Blavatsky Lodge are extremely helpful in at least clarifying how she saw things. Premanashish described this initial stage of awakening or reawakening, we perhaps should call it. These two poles of being, give rise to a field of relationship in which objective content can be discerned. And in this field, the patterns of the divine archetypes previously hidden in latency will make their first appearance. So now we are moving from consciousness towards, if we can call it, universal mind, divine mind. And she uses the term Mahat, in fact, you see. We're not down to the individualized point, mind yet, but now we can begin to see the emergence in this field now is alive with consciousness, and the patterning is that of Mahat, divine mind. But of course, the poles are only apart in imagination, not in reality. That's a difficult point for us to realize. This does not mean that the process is imaginary, but rather that it defies our descriptive abilities. We must remember that all is process, which we're all emphasizing. This seems to be the thread of this school, process. When we read, therefore, when we read that the last vibration thrills through infinitude, the vibration is not separate from the archetypes that will emerge, nor are the archetypes which will be revealed separate from the energy which reveals them. We may relate the process, in one sense, to what happens within ourselves when there builds up within our own psyches such a pressure that we may say the psychic structures of our being are either in such close relationship or in such conflict that we can no longer bear the pressure. And the energy is so great that it must manifest itself outwardly, projected indeed in images. And incidentally, it is those projections, which are not imaginary but real enough in themselves, which get us into trouble, become, if you will, the causes of misery when those projections that build up results in anger, rage, passion, and so on. Although in another sense, they're also the ways to bliss when that build-up results in love, compassion, and outpouring of selfless and altruistic service. Now, as HPB points out, the release of the tension, or what the shloka calls the last vibration of the seventh eternity, was foreordained. But, as she further states, this seemingly deterministic action was not by virtue of some command of an extra-cosmic deity, but rather by virtue of this primary law of rhythmicity. So it's by virtue of its own nature. As we've already suggested, and as HPB herself states, it is not then a change in size, but in condition. And we may lose sight of this point when we attempt to give number to the logoic action. as, for example, HPB does in explanation of this shloka in the Transactions. Number is always sequential, or almost always so. Mark, we've talked a little bit about this. But we overlook the essential nature of the process. For example, in the Transactions, HPB states that the seventh vibration applies both to the first and to the manifested Logos. At the time of the primordial radiation, or when the second Logos emanates, it is Father, Mother potentially. But when the third or manifested Logos appears, it becomes the Virgin Mother. Now here is where we have to become, I think, even more careful, because we tend then to speak of these logoi, as Adam so rightly pointed out yesterday, and I couldn't emphasize or applaud him any more than I am trying to, because I think it's so important that what HPB is trying to do in using these numbers is only to indicate differentiations of states, not of entities. Now it's your turn, you see. I'm the first Logos, and you're the second, and now it's your turn, and now it's your turn as the third, and I can sit back while you do the next little bit. By any means, we must get away from this. And her use of number is not, therefore, to indicate so much separate entities as changes of condition of the process.
Yes, and yet she does say somewhere else that having brought the manifest Logos into the position, the unmanifest one withdraws.
Yes, that's right.
She does say
Because that's right. Because that aspect of the creative potential is no longer active. It's as though the radiation having occurred, which is a kind of pulsation, the emanational process will now move on.
Started.
It's
Done.
started. Yes,
It's on its way.
it's on its way. But it's not an easy concept at all.
But the unmanifested still remains.
It still remains, yes, still
Absolutely.
remains. Yes, absolutely, you see. So, as I say, it makes it appear that we have a succession of logoi, or active principles, outside of the one, whereas in reality, if we follow through the fundamental principle of the occult philosophy, there can be nothing outside the one, which, to use Günther's phrase again, spontaneously presents itself in differentiated aspects. Hence the expansion from within without of that universal matrix space itself, ever abiding and permitting all changes of conditions within itself, but never itself changing. Oh dear, it's time. Oh dear, it's time. Well, with that then, I'll leave this. With this, and perhaps get a bit into Shloka 3, and then I will pause and give you a chance to breathe, perhaps a little more easily, from some of the language. But first I'd like to suggest that it may be appropriate at this point in our studies to emphasize that in the intellectual history of the late 19th and early 20th century, there was no more significant event than what has been called the revolutionary paradigm shift. That word paradigm has become very popular in contemporary language, and of course one of the fundamental books that has been published in recent years dealing with this is the work by Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn. I can't even remember the title of his book. Isn't that dreadful? But it's a basic work in which he uses this term of paradigm shifts, that there have been critical periods in history when there has been, as it were, a complete shift in our model of the universe, in our perception. And of course, the Newtonian breakthrough was just such a paradigm shift. And that one occurred, of course, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not even 10 years after the publication of the Secret Doctrine, but after HPB's death. In about the mid-1890s, the first of these really tremendous upheavals. And it was, of course, a shift primarily from theories based on the primacy of matter to theories based on the primacy of relations. And I think we can state it that simply. And HPB, I think, undoubtedly foresaw this shift. And at least her teachers did in the presentation or representation of this wisdom tradition to the Western world. And to what extent, of course, the publication of the Secret Doctrine in 1888 influenced the thought currents of the scientific world, we'll never be able to say. But within half a dozen years of that publication began the first stages of the tremendous paradigm shift with the work of James Clerk Maxwell. His discovery that it was impossible to understand electromagnetic phenomena in traditional Newtonian terms of discrete units of matter was, of course, very soon followed at the turn of the century by the work of Max Planck, which led to the quantum theory, and the work of Einstein in the general relativity theory and specific relativity theory. And as I said yesterday, probably the greatest impetus to this shift and the most unsettling was that by Werner Heisenberg in the enunciation of what has always come to be called the uncertainty principle. I think we have to be very clear what is meant by that. It's not that things may not be certain, but rather that one cannot measure both the velocity and the position of subatomic particles at the same time. Well, it's interesting that at the same time, and this is something that may not be as well known to you, theories in linguistics also underwent a great paradigm shift. And theories in psychology and anthropology also underwent tremendous revolutionary shifts. And I think all of these tremendous upheavals in these fields, linguistics, psychology, and anthropology, which have never really been traced in the same manner. And someday, given enough time, I'd like to deal with these to some extent, because I think they are equally significant for our worldview, brought about the recognition of the primacy of what we can only call archetypal structures. So far as linguistics is concerned, this began about the turn of the century, and they're very well summarized in a book by Paul Kugler, Kugler, called The Alchemy of Discourse, an archetypal approach to language. I happen to be very much interested in language, and as you can see, I invent words with a complete disregard to anything. I was fascinated the other day, soon after my arrival. Marion sat me down before the television, and with your marvelous program, Child's Play. I think it's a tremendous program because the child gives a definition of a word, whether he knows what the definition is or not. And I think, one of the truly occult works of literature is, of course, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Not at all a child's book, but truly a very significant occult work. And so, as Alice said, when I use a word, it means precisely what I say it means. And I think this is, sufficient for me. And so, but words very definitely reflect this. And we can see this entire process, indeed, in terms of this progression of sound from, and as HPB has done, and as Sibero has done, in terms of the emergence of these from the inaudible, from that which underlies it, paravach, to the expression in the objective world, vicarivach. I'm not going to go into that. But I interject this here in our discussion of the first two shlokas of stanza 3, because it is with the reawakening of the cosmos, with the reawakening of the process, rather, that the process of existence is externalized, not so much in terms of static objects, but in the objectivity of process, or the objectivity of relations. And that, I think, is the clue. Adam asked me during the break, I'm trying to recall how you put it, Adam, we were discussing existence. How did you put that? This radiation or emanation, was it radiation, was not yet existence, or at least I suggested to you it was not yet. I know. You asked why Ginther uses the term presencing instead of existence. That's it. A very interesting question, and I think the word presencing he is using at this initial stage where there is the subtle movement, if you like, from darkness to light, which is the only metaphor that we seem to be able to use at this stage. It certainly is the metaphor that the stanzas use, that there is this change of condition from darkness to light. Nothing has happened, if you notice, nothing has happened but a change of condition. Now, presencing is that. Existence, and Ginther in Matrix of Mystery and in his translation of the Tibetan text seems to keep the word existence for a later stage, which is this objectivity now, because the word existence means to stand forth. Now, what originally stands forth are the archetypal patterns from which the reflections, the images, will be drawn. And this externalization is referred to by HPB herself in her commentary by the statement that all this, that is, all that is presenced, is but the temporary reflection, the shadow of the eternal ideal prototype in divine thought. This is page 63. So with the developments in the world of ideas that followed on the publication of the Secret Doctrine, it could be said that the archetypal world is presented directly through what has been called the imago mundi, the image of the world, which can be heard as well as seen. The philosopher Wittgenstein, for example, put it that phenomena show themselves. This was his phrase. So we begin to see that the primacy now of that presencing, which is radiation, not yet emanation, shows itself as the primacy of the archetype. And this, of course, is further explicated by HPB in her answer to a question in Transactions. I have the page number in my edition of the Transactions, but I think there are different editions.
There are different editions.
Yes, so you have to read very carefully the questions and answers with regard to stanza 3.
And it is in volume 12.
Yes, it's in volume 12 of the collected writings. Thank you, Yanthi, for reminding me of that. I really feel that, of course, while HPB never was able to answer questions on all these stanzas, that as far as she went, as far as we have a record of her answers, certainly is very valuable, because very frequently it adds to her commentary in the Secret Doctrine. So she explains this, that in the absolute or divine thought, everything exists, and there has been no time when it did not so exist. But divine ideation is limited by the universal manvantaras. So what is to stand forth of these prototypes or archetypes, and we're using archetype now in the Platonic sense, is dependent on, in a sense, what the light reveals of that entire space, shall we say, darkness. Now, we cannot know, we can only conjecture, whether other systems, other manvantaras, will produce other existences. We can only conjecture that this is undoubtedly true, and will. So she says, the realm of Akasha is the undifferentiated noumenal and abstract space which will be occupied by Chidakasham, the field of primordial consciousness. Now, it's not, again, that something is occupying a space where something already is, but rather that this portion, or this field that is now lit up, Chidakasham, the field of consciousness, is all that is available to us. It's the givens of our system. And that's what we have to work with, and we might as well be satisfied. But she says, of course, that this has several degrees, in fact, 7 fields. The first is the field of latent consciousness, which is coeval with the duration of the first and second unmanifested logoi. When the hour strikes for the third logos to appear, then from the latent potentiality there radiates a lower field of differentiated consciousness, which is Mahat. This is why I've saved that, you see. Or the entire collectivity of those Dhyan Chohans of sentient life, of which Fohat is the representative on the objective plane and the Manasaputras on the subjective. Well, there's so much in that that is not immediately relevant, so I'm not going to get into it. I leave the subject of the Manasaputras to Adam. Well, you handled it so wonderfully in your Blavatsky lecture, so I'm leaving that for you. But as the process of reawakening moves forward, we're reminded again by HPB that the language used is purely figurative. And if there were time, of course, we could explore the whole nature of language as representative of archetypal structures, particularly since language as sound is so closely related to the entire cosmogonic process. In the Tibetan text to which I constantly refer, and which Ginther has presented us in the Matrix of Mystery, this unfolding or emergence of existence from the singularity of a point of being has three major configurations. And that's rather interesting because the way he defines these three major configurations, again, language, yes, but he calls it facticity, and the second, authentic utterance, and the third is resonating concern. Rather interesting phrase which we'll come to eventually, I think, in our studies. But rather interesting, you see, in his translation of this text. Now, this authentic utterance is the vibration, which of course sweeps along, as the shloka puts it. It's referred to as the creativity of excitatory intelligence, which in itself is a virtual singularity, which a term Gunther borrows from contemporary science. And so he puts it this way, that the creativity of this singularity lies in its lucency or radiating character that pervades and is inseparable from its field or continuum.
Which is,
And that's the facticity, you see. It's also a lucency. The creativity of this singularity, which is its facticity. It's, if you like, it's reality. But he is not using, he carefully avoids the term reality, and probably for a very good reason, because again, it means so many things, you see. What is real? But the facticity, the quality of being an indisputable, incontrovertible fact, the absolute, you see. That quality, so facticity. The creativity of that lies in its lucency. It illumines. Or radiating character. And we've talked about that, you see. That pervades and is inseparable from its field or continuum. The field character of the creativity of the virtual singularity possesses both homogeneity, the property of being independent of position and open throughout, and the property of being totally independent of direction and lucent with equal intensity in all directions. Now this is, I think, a marvelous description of Chidakasham. Equal intensity in all directions, equally illuminated throughout. This homogeneous substance.
It's the first stage of waking up, when the point of consciousness surveys its empty field.
Yes.
Of when you first wake up in the morning.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So, as he says, this lucency or isotropic radiation is indeed excitatory intelligence. It is consciousness which is vibrating, which is inseparable from the field and all-encompassing. And so, you see, it is the field. It's inseparable from the field. And so this singularity is, of course, referred to in the shloka as the germ that dwelleth in darkness. But as the verse reminds us, the darkness is not dead or inert. It has within it its own becomingness. It's not, further, of course, it's not a thing, for no thing exists in the darkness. It is the abstract potentiality in non-being of expressing itself in being. Now, the very use of the term point, you see, which is, a point is dimensionless. And this is indicated because it is indeed pervades the entire field. It is the field pervading itself. It's interesting that today in contemporary science, there is this feeling that perhaps space has as many as 11 dimensions. Perhaps they will eventually come to its dimensionless quality, but that at least within the first milliseconds following the Big Bang, there may have been 11 dimensions. But what happened before that, you see, because they haven't pushed it back further. So this is in the period before there was any manifestation, therefore, dimensions, you see. So that all that exists, and I quote now again from Matrix of Mystery, all that exists without exception, each and everything, the whole of reality, in the sense of the whole of manifestation, has sprung from the one point instant that is the operational source. So the operational unit within the, as quote Günther, I hope you don't mind his language, but I think it stirs something in us. The operational unit within the dynamics of sheer lucency is the discrete photon-like radiating packet which occurs as an outward directed glow of excitatory intelligence. Tough, yes, I know. And in connection with the later movements, then, which the stanzas describe as the action of Fohat, Günther continues this with, this lucency has a field character that is termed center when the field is conceived of as having a centripetal movement. It is termed a turbulent vortex when it has a centrifugal movement. And if anything could be more descriptive of our situation in the realm of mirrored existence than the turbulent vortex, this is the world egg which is curdled, which we get later on, you see. Well, so as the Tibetan text further says, self-existent is what is meant by excitatory intelligence, self-existent. It is free from causes and conditions, open, lucent, it is full of light, and spontaneously there. Lucent is full of light, yes. Pristine cognitiveness is the former's ceaseless lucency. That's pristine cognitiveness, which is consciousness, pristine knowingness, which is present. Singularity means that although there is lucency, this is not something in itself, for what is meant is the indivisibility of its own being. It's a continuum. That which is open, lucent, invariant, a point instant, virtual, singular, is the root of everything subsumed by the terms samsara and nirvana. If the meaningfulness of this self-existent, pristine cognitive is understood, one becomes knowledgeable regarding the entirety of reality through comprehending the import of this singularity. At a later stage, it's the question, you see, that Arjuna asks, what is that knowing which all else is known?
Could you just go over the difference again in these terms between samsara and nirvana? Is the samsara the objectivity of the whatever it is, and nirvana is the subjectivity?
The subjective, yes.
Cognizes.
Yes, that's right. And that, I'm sure, is the way in which it's being used in this text, you see. So in its outward turn, which is why in the very first stanza, you see, the causes, the ways of bliss and the causes of misery do not exist. You cannot have one without the other, and yet each is but a reflection of the other. They are, you see, Nagarjuna, as we know, saw this very clearly. Samsara is nirvana, and nirvana is samsara. Between the two, there is no difference. Was the statement of the great Nagarjuna. So these are the two modes of entry. So it's the root of everything, that which is open, lucent, invariant, a point instant, virtual, singular, is the root of everything subsumed by the terms samsara and nirvana. Because, you see, this is, we often come up against the question, you see, how did evil get into the system, as it were? How did they, that which it seems the contrary? And we see it here as dual, therefore. But it's all rooted. The root of everything is in this singularity. And if the real meaningfulness, then, of self-existent, pristine cognitiveness, a marvelous phrase, but the self-existent, svabhavat, pristine consciousness, the pure, unsullied, without any object arising within it, consciousness, knowingness, because it's at Mahat, divine mind, is understood. One becomes knowledgeable regarding the entirety of reality through comprehending the import of this singularity. This is really the root of the Theosophic metaphysics, which is why I'm spending time on it.
And of meditational practice.
And of all meditational practice. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And leads, you see, inevitably to Arjuna's question, what is that knowing which all else is known? And marvelous. You see, the royal secret is then conveyed. At this point, you see, and this is why we have to be very clear on this, causality is irrelevant. You see, one could say that when the sun appears, its rays, or collectively its ray, is spontaneously present. The presence of the sun does not cause the ray so much as permit its own essence to ray forth.
What are you saying now? Is this from Gunther?
No, that's from me. You'll know Gunther's language by the main words. I've tried to simplify it. But we don't say that the sun's appearance causes the ray. Its own nature is the ray, is the raying forth, the radiation, isn't it? It's the nature of the sun. The sun does not say, now I'm going to send a ray down, and you say. It's an auto-presencing. And causality at this stage is irrelevant. And I think this is very, so seen from this point of view, all existence standing forth of that which has hitherto been concealed is a movement toward a freezing into forms of the archetypal non-forms. And it must be followed inevitably by a counter-movement, which is a freeing or release of the archetype from the frozen form, or a return to the singularity. Although we have not yet commented on this point, we should mention before we proceed, of course, that for the singularity, time has no meaning and comes into play only when the measurability of space becomes possible, which is way down the line.
Singularity is the frozen stage.
Mm-hmm. No, the unfrozen, well, it then freezes. It's a freezing into forms which we then hold on to, you see, from the archetypal non-form. The only way we approach from this point of view, the archetypal, is through its images, therefore. But we mustn't confuse the map with the territory then. Incidentally, in a marvelous chapter, rather long one, Ginther discusses this in terms of Tibetan iconography in a chapter called Fury of Being, because it is present in Tibetan iconography. And the image that is used, of course, is the palace of the king. And talking of meditational practices, it's very interesting to compare that, the entry into the palace of the king and all of that, with St. Teresa's interior castle, which is very much the same thing, by a Western mystic. Rather interesting. And yet I am sure that St. Teresa never knew of this imagery of the iconography of the Tibetans. I'm quite sure she had no knowledge of it. So it shows that behind both lies an archetypal reality. Very interesting to do that. And of course, one can see this psychological binding and freeing then, which is naturally the subject of genuine yoga. And the entire projection, you see, from the point of view of this particular icon, or this particular mandala, if you want to call it that, this particular image which through which Ginther explores it, which is the palace in this Tibetan manuscript, and he does it in this chapter called Fury of Being. The entire projection of a manifested system is the result of the interior fury of the One, just as we may also say that the One is the supreme yogi. But it's a kind of fury that builds up, that projects. Well, another point that is extremely important, particularly at this stage, when it appears that the process, the cosmogonic process, is beginning its turning outwards, concerns the background, or simply the ground, which in our shloka is denominated darkness. We may tend, then, to conceive of that ground or source as non-moving, in the sense of completely static. And there is a tendency, you see, except that HPB reminds us that motion is primary. Breath, the great breath.
Motion requires two places.
Yes.
You see, in this sense, there's only the point where you are.
Yes.
It couldn't be
anywhere else.
But where you are.
Mm-hmm. But you see, that's according to the principle of uncertainty. You can't define it because
Because it doesn't belong to any place.
And it doesn't belong to any place, you see. And Ginther points out in discussing then the Tibetan text that as the entire process that is made explicit is already present in the ground is neither an autonomous nor closed and static system. It is merely the name given to being's undivided and unbroken totality. The ground is a thoroughly dynamic energy process which is open, that is, it defies any reduction, ever active in its radiance and sheer lucency, and through the pervasively inherent intelligence operative as a resonating concern that preserves the integrity of this totality in all its variegated facets. That's a tough statement. But that then is why then he uses this term. It is operative as a resonating concern.
It's actually a projection from this point.
Yes.
Isn't it?
And it's through that, you see.
The field in which he operates.
And it's operative as a resonating concern that preserves the integrity of the totality. In terms of its reflections, then, it is a compassionate system. And HPB, I think, makes this clear in The Voice of the Silence in a very marvelous statement, you see. Compassion is no attribute. It is the law of laws. It's a marvelous statement. It's not an attribute. And we think of it as an attribute. I will have compassion. But when we see this as the expression, you see, ever active in its radiance and sheer lucency, and through the pervasively inherent intelligence or consciousness, operative as a resonating concern because of the radiation. It resonates, you see. Again, sound, it resonates throughout the entire system to preserve the integrity of this totality in all its multiplicity of facets, in all of its multiplicity of exhibitions, the manifoldness. But the resonating concern is fundamentally, then, that which preserves the integrity of the whole. We begin to see how these qualifications, if you like, arise, these qualities. All right, a little further quote then from the Tibetan text. The facticity of this ground as a totality is indivisible with respect to its openness and lucency. Its actuality is indivisible with respect to its lucency and openness. And its resonating concern is indivisible with respect to its excitatory intelligence and openness. Something really to consider. The authentic utterance becomes its actuality. It actualizes through authentic utterance. And
what do you think the word authentic means in that case? What is authentic utterance? Is it that which has a specific result, brings about what you intended to bring about?
I think so. I think it includes all that. Muriel?
That which is the author.
Yeah, that which is, yes, the author.
No, that makes good sense.
Yes,
Yeah.
you say.
Yes, that makes very good sense.
So there is, you see, this threefoldness, and I think it illuminates these terms as you come to deal with them, you see. So you can, rather than, I've used authentic utterance in other places, he uses actuality. It actualizes, but it does so through authentic utterance, and is then one which operates through then resonating concern, which preserves the integrity. If there were not that, the integrity would not be, which is the wholeness, the totality, would not be preserved. Now this action, of course, may seem sequential because of our language, but in point of fact, of course, is non-linear in the spontaneity and simultaneity of energy process. Remember that, yes, the action seems sequential,
Yes.
you see,
Yes.
but is not so. It's our language that makes it sequential. But in point of fact, it is non-linear in the spontaneous self-presencing, auto-presencing. Remember, our language defines our worldview. Kugler, for example, in his work that I've referred to, The Alchemy of Discourse, points out that the language we speak radically organizes and biases the cosmos we speak about. Incidentally, this point in regard to language was very much brought to the fore in the 1930s, in the United States at least, and has had a tremendous effect on linguistic studies throughout the world by a theosophist, you may not realize, by the name of Benjamin Lee Whorf, whom I knew, who was associated very closely with Fritz Kuntz in the Foundation for Integrative Education. Whorf, incidentally, was the father of the man that married the daughter of Jim and Catherine Perkins. But Benjamin Lee Whorf's work, which I think is now out of print, unfortunately, a marvelous book called Language, Thought, and Reality, if you ever can get it. It was published by Massachusetts Institute of Technology Press, MIT Press, was a seminal work, and it is still used and still referred to in all linguistic studies. You can ask John Elgio, for example, very well-known work. Whorf demonstrated as early as 1934 through a comparative study of English, Navajo, and the Hopi languages. These are two of our Southwest Indian cultures, very far, really quite advanced cultures, that no individual, and I quote now from Whorf, "No individual is free to describe nature with absolute impartiality, but is constrained to certain modes of interpretation, even while he thinks himself most free." And as I pointed out yesterday, the fantastic number of conjugations of the verb to go in the Navajo language. And how many conjugations of the verb to go do we have in English?
Could you give us some examples of theirs?
Yes, he goes this morning is different from he went yesterday, or he will go tomorrow. And it's different from he goes in snow, from he goes in sun, from he goes in the wind, or he goes in rain. All of these have to have a different verbal form, you see, because these are important things in the Navajo's life. One sees this in many cultures, you see. The Polynesians, for example, have no word for snow, or it is snowing. Whereas the Eskimo has, I think it's over nearly 50 words for that, because it was extremely important to the Eskimo to know the kind of snow and when it snowed and how deep it snowed and all the rest. The Polynesian, of course, couldn't care less. He said never had an experience with snow.
May I illustrate this?
Yes.
As a child, I was living in Indonesia,
Yes.
the Indies, and we had the freak storm and hailstones fell. And all the little Japanese Indian people said, "Well, what is this?"
Yes.
They never experienced it.
Yes. And there was no language, no word for it. Yes. This is why in a language like Tamil in South India, which is a very ancient language, Dravidian origins, you see, not part of the Indo-European as Sanskrit is, but Dravidian origins, Tamil is not able to within its own language take on things. So they suddenly you hear a Tamilian speaking, going on telephone, because there is no way to create that word in Tamil. And this is why English is indeed one of the most flexible language, because I can create rhythmicity if I want to, and you get a kind of sense of what I mean, even if I'm not, even if you don't find it. You know, many of you know that I created one word that I've always liked very much, and I've now added to it. You see, I created the word, which I think is a very good word, which is flink. You see, which means we feel and think at the same time. We cannot separate our. Now I've made it a better word. I'm calling it perflink, which I think is even better.
Blinkicity.
Yes, but this means we perceive, feel, and think at the same time. You see, it's a unified process. And perceive, feel, and think. And I think perflink is a perfectly good word, you see. And someday, perhaps, I will be memorialized as the creator. And, you know, Oxford English Dictionary says who first used these words. You know, it may have after it parentheses Mills.
Can you get a pronoun for deity that takes in he and she?
That I'm working on. But you see, hence the value of grappling even with the language of these stanzas, which are said, of course, HPB translated, even in the translation that HPB gives us, because she was limited to the words, the vocabulary that was available to her.